Thank you, Jess. It's great to be here. Wonderful to be in Australia. I'm not sure if I'm Simon's boss or Simon is my boss. Who in here has heard of or knows Simon Quilty? That guy does not sleep, right? I get texts from him at 2 a.m., 4 a.m., day and night. He'll call me and say, hey, Brett, I need some data. Can you run some data send over? But it's been a wonderful adventure working with Simon. I've been coming to Australia. I was thinking the first year, I think, was 2010. My work has taken me all over the world, and I truly, truly enjoy Australia. But your secret's safe with me. The last month or so, everybody has been asking when I talk about my work back home, and I said I'm going to Australia. In America, everyone's like, oh, I would love to go to Australia. Your secret is safe with me, right? I don't tell them everything, because the last thing you want is 300 million Americans over here. You would be like the Bali of America. You'd have all the Americans coming. No, it really is. It's one of my favorite places to be. Last week on the podcast, Simon and I were talking about, we started out with the Olympics. We sent a podcast to all our clients. And he said, we need to do a medal count. And so I grabbed a medal count and put it on. And he said, no, that's the wrong medal count. It was a total medal count. He said, we need to rank it by gold medals, not by total medals. And some of you may have seen our podcast. And the reason was Australia was ahead of the U.S. last week in gold medals. And so I had the Simon version. I had to show it. Now, just an update, and there's a lot of things to talk about, but we could talk about U.S. politics, but that's boring. Nobody wants to hear that. U.S. politics, I know, is very highly entertaining outside of America. Inside of America, it's terrifying, right? Because we have to live with it. We have the system where we find the two least popular Americans out of 338 million Americans, and then we run them against each other to be the president. I have no idea how that system works. No, forget that. We'll talk about the Olympics. I looked at the medal count this morning. Number 1, U.S., gold medal count. Number 2, China. Number 3, Australia. 18 gold medals, right? 18. That's a record. The most gold medals Australia's ever won is 17. You're at 18 today, and it's not over. So good on you, mates. That's incredible. I mean, how was that? I practiced that a lot. No, fantastic. So with that, I think most of you are aware of what we do. My work is involved in trying to keep a finger on the pulse of global agriculture markets. And it has taken me all over the world. I grew up on a cattle and sheep operation operating in Utah and Wyoming in the high deserts of America, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So my job and Simon's job is a little bit difficult because it's like trying to be a weather forecaster. Everyone wants to know, what are the markets going to do next week, next month, next year? And a couple of years ago, I read a book, and the book called into question this statement: is the future predictable? And the point of this book was, basically, the word unpredictable means unable to be predicted. And so the point of the author was, if you're trying to predict the unpredictable, you are a fool, at best a charlatan, right? No one knows the future. You're crazy to try to predict the future. And it made me kind of call into question my life choices and said, I'm trying to make a living doing this, right? But I realized some trends are unmistakable. So I ask you in your mind, is the future predictable? And to help you answer that question, I'm going to show you a picture. Is the future predictable? Right? Some guy's about to get eaten by a very angry mother bear. And I just love that man's friend who stood there and held the camera and instead of saving his life, took the picture. It's probably photoshopped. I found it online. But you get the point, right? There are times you can look, and I can look at markets and say, I'm not psychic, but it sure looks like something is going to happen here. So with that, let me shift here and talk through what we're going to cover. Market signals. Market signals are important, and I know you guys are very good. Any farmer is very good at market signals. We'll talk about Australian sheep and lamb, a look to the future, and then just some key thoughts and advice from my perspective. So Agriculture Economics 101, I'm sure everyone loved econ in uni, right, in college. No, everyone hated econ. But the function of free markets is very simple. Free markets allocate resources among buyers and sellers using price. At the equilibrium price, the sellers and buyers both get what they want, and markets are very efficient at doing this. However, in agriculture markets, all markets cycle. Due to weather, due to fear and greed, regulations, politics, there's all kinds of things that move these markets. And markets are usually not in equilibrium. They're usually too much or too little of something. So, let me give you just a little bit of background on the U.S. sheep flock. So I was raised on a cattle ranch operating in the western U.S., and we were cowboys, right? Anyone see the movie Yellowstone? It's basically just like that without all the murders and crazy stuff. No, it's nothing like that. But my grandfather made the decision to go and buy a sheep operation. He bought 6,000 sheep over in Wyoming, 6 different herds of 1,000 each that were running in Wyoming. And I think we had the sheep for about 15, 20 years. Ended up selling the sheep operation. Depends on who you ask, whether those were the happiest days of their life or the darkest days of their life. The sheep days were tough, and as a kid, it was a lot of work. But these sheep, the way we ran, we had these bands of sheep that would range 200 kilometers from summer to winter, and they were always moving, just slowly moving, 6 different herds of sheep, 200 kilometers back and forth, usually on someone else's land, which is crazy that you can do that in America. But with established trail rights, you can trail sheep across other people's land. It's the reason sheep guys and cattle guys hate each other in America. But we were always moving these sheep. And it was a lot of work. Some of those sheep ranged up in the high mountains, up above timberline, 3,200 meters. We used pack horses to carry in food and gear to the sheep herders. But if you look at that U.S. sheep flock, in 1867, now that's a ways back, 45 million sheep. And in 1884, the U.S. sheep flock peaked at 51 million. By 2016, there were 5 million. That's pretty incredible, right? And today, I would tell you, looking at our sheep operation, virtually all of them are gone. In the western U.S., where we ran sheep, none of our competitors are really operating today. It's been quite a change, and why is that? There were pressures about regulation. We had huge predator issues. Coyotes were a massive problem. We would hire pilots in helicopters just to fly around and shoot coyotes. We used 1080 poison until it was illegal. Then we slowly phased out over the next 10 years or so. But it was very effective poison, but it was phased out. Loss of demand for wool, the adjustment of consumers shifting to poultry, and really it was all about cost competitiveness. Now, what I found out about sheep is sheep have no self-defense mechanism, right? Most animals have some kind of self-defense mechanism. Sheep's response to anything, I decided, is to basically lay down and die. Whether it's get bit by a coyote, lay down and die. Get 3 feet of snow, lay down and die. It's a huge amount of work to keep sheep alive. And one thing that we found in that area was when the sheep industry left, it didn't leave a ghost town. Most of that range got converted to cattle. And as good a grazers as sheep are, they're fantastic grazers, better than cattle. But the way that works in the high deserts of the western U.S., cattle were better equipped with the snow, better equipped with predators and some of those things. So it was a bit of a shift. So that picture is my father. He passed away 25 years ago, but that was on a shearing day, and we used to have the portable corrals. We'd go set up and shear the sheep. It was quite an adventure, and we would do a band every day, 1,000 sheep a day. The first Australians I ever saw were our sheep shearers. Our sheep shearers would come from Australia. And they sat in a big trailer, and we would sort the ewes in to get shoed. We'd sort the lambs off and dock lambs. I think I got a picture of docking lambs here, one of the great childhood adventures I had. But I would go and peek in that big trailer and watch those Australians shearing sheep. And wow, could they make the wool fly. It was absolutely incredible to watch them shear sheep. I think they had 4 stations, and we would do 1,000 a day. And they would just, every day, they were shearing somewhere else. It was the off season that they would shear in North America. Pretty incredible to watch. There's some of the herders. We use mostly immigrants from Latin America. Mexico would come up and herd sheep. But truly, it's a message to think about of adaptation, and we just simply had to adapt and adjust. I'm not saying that's your future. We'll talk more about your competitiveness as I go through. Market signals are very clear and very direct. They let us know when we have too much and when we don't have enough. This chart shows the global food and ag indices. This is the global price of agriculture commodities from 2000 back through July 2024. And there you can see prices cycle, right? We went through some massive commodity cycles. The biggest one in history we've just come through. And I have up there, commodity markets are like airplanes. What I mean by that is this. We have not yet left one up there. Right? They go up and they come down. They don't go up forever. Now, they don't come down as low as they've been, and you can see that long-term trend line shows long-term agriculture commodity price inflation. We just went through a massive wave of inflation. And if you look, most commodities are below trend line. It doesn't feel like that, right? Everything, expenses are very high. Trend line is 25 basis points higher than it was before COVID. And so even though we're off of that, it still feels very inflationary in the markets. And so what are the sources of inflation? We have economic inflation, commodity inflation. One is weather. Drought had a big impact on this last commodity super cycle. One, that little virus, maybe you heard of it, COVID, had an impact, right? Massive impact on inflation. And also war. And so those 3 things really drove it. Let me talk about COVID for just a minute. The best way I can explain it is with a political cartoon. And so this is the COVID-19 wildfire. The plane is the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Congress is trying to put out the COVID wildfire. And there's 2 voices out of the cockpit. And the first voice says, "That's strange-looking fire retardant." And the second response to that is, "It's money." Right? Because that's what the U.S. Congress does. That's the only tool at their disposal, is just pouring money on everything. And that's what they tried to do with COVID. In fact, they put out $6 trillion into the U.S. economy. It increased our money supply 40% in 2 years. That is enormously inflationary. And it's the source not just of sticky inflation. That's why we have sticky interest rates. There are still mountains of cash held out of commodities, held out of real estate by these high interest-bearing treasuries. And the second the U.S. Fed starts to cut those rates, there's going to be a lot of cash that wants to come back into these commodities. And so that's causing rates to be artificially high. Now, it wasn't just the U.S. that did this. If you look at global COVID stimulus, $17 trillion worldwide poured into this global financial economy. And so that is a massive source of inflation. It's simply more money divided by the same amount of stuff. Now, in the sheep and lamb business in Australia, there was a different type of inflation. It wasn't due to a huge surge in money. Take a look at this chart. This is that UN data, Food and Ag Index worldwide, and you can see beef, pork, poultry, and ovine. Look at those sheep and lamb prices. Pretty incredible, right? Very high prices. And again, commodities markets are like airplanes. They don't stay up forever. The golden rule of ag economics is high prices fix high prices, and vice versa. So if we look at this, what did that market tell us from 2017 to 2023? What is that telling us? Make more lamb, right? The market wanted more than we had. We were not in equilibrium. And so the price just keeps going up, sending a very strong signal. When you get that strong a signal for 5 years, what happens? You make way more lamb. And then what happens? No one ever makes the right amount in a commodity cycle. We never say, okay, here's just the right amount of expansion we need. We overproduce, and then the market tells us too much, too much. And that's exactly what happened. Look at what those high prices did. This is Australian lamb production on the left, and it's Australian domestic lamb consumption on the right. That was a massive amount of lamb on the market. This was a very reasonable market reaction to see those prices go to where we've seen them the last year. Completely cratered that market. Is productivity a blessing or a curse? And every farmer will say it's a blessing, right? It's the way we stay competitive, and it is. That's correct. Global agriculture productivity is probably the greatest story never told of our lifetime. When you look at productivity around the world, at how we have been able to feed those 8 billion people and how we will be able to feed 10 billion people, it's all due to productivity. Productivity cuts our per unit costs. It increases yield. It makes us more competitive. But too much too fast, as you all know very well, can swamp markets. And I don't know if you all got triplets last year, how you did that. But productivity can be a bear in the markets. Here's the question for your group. Is Australian lamb and mutton competitive globally? And I would say a resounding yes, incredibly competitive globally. Look at those exports, and that big production in 2023 took you up over 570,000 metric tons of lamb exported from Australia. China, US, and others. And China, of course, the big growth market there. Pretty incredible. And absolutely, when I go to the grocery stores in the US, I never see U.S. lamb. I don't know where U.S. lamb is eaten. It must all go to restaurants, but I only see Australia, New Zealand lamb in the meat case. And I'm a lamb eater. I actually bought a lamb at the fair last year, and my kids and my wife don't like it, but I have single-handedly eaten that lamb this year. Yeah, go me, huh? No, it is. I do. I love lamb. As a kid, all I ate was mutton. Because when you have a sheep operation, you don't eat the lambs, you sell the lambs. And so all I ate was mutton. And I thought, man, these things are terrible. It wasn't until I grew up and went to a restaurant, I was like, wow, lamb is really pretty good. So let's take a look into the future. So here's Simon's forecast. This is the heavy lamb prices. And he made that forecast back in April. And you can see March was at $6.50. And your prices have followed almost exactly his forecast about 1 month earlier. And so definitely prices have improved. They've come off of those terrible lows where you were last year. But what do we see going forward? Here's his trade lamb price 5-year outlook. So right now, 23-24 is kind of the holding pattern for those prices. He shows 25, 26, 27 as rising into a top. And so the future looks good, right? This is the optimist view, back above 1,000 cents per kilo in 2026. And so if this doesn't happen within those parameters, I'll give you Simon Quilty's email, and you can email him and tell him, hey, Simon, you missed that one. It's always fun to present someone else's forecast, right? No, I don't mind long-term forecasts. If someone asks me what's the market going to do next week, and I'm wrong, they call me and tell me. But if I say, here's what the market is going to do 3 years from now, no one ever calls me and tells me when I'm wrong. So, from the U.S. standpoint, lamb demand is strong. It really is phenomenal. For as little of lamb is consumed in the U.S., it's pretty shocking. And Simon's mantra for the last 2 years has been, lamb is the new Wagyu when we look at the U.S. market. Who's the king of the U.S. retail case? Look at those prices. It is unbelievable that we have retail beef prices nearly $7 a pound in the U.S. But look at the lamb prices, above $8. The most expensive meat in the U.S. retail case is lamb. That shows you how good that demand is. It's priced way above beef. What about the demand beyond America globally? We'll talk about that here in a minute. But one thing to watch, global beef herds, whether it's South America, Australia, or the U.S., are all moving into liquidation almost at the same time. Something is happening in the global beef market that's going to be very supportive to lamb over the next 3 to 5 years. So let me shift gears and show you here as we talk about demand just a little bit. Being the data nerd that I am, I download and run any kind of data I can find. And so I downloaded the annual global GDP, gross economic output, global GDP, and I scatter plotted that against global meat and poultry consumption. So every one of those green dots is a year from 1970 to 2021. And usually when you download two data sets and you plot them against each other, you get a scatter plot, shotgun blast. And then you try to find a correlation between the two. This data is unadjusted data. Total GDP against total meat and poultry consumption. And it's a 0.98 fit. It's almost a perfect fit. And so economists would tell you correlation does not equal causation. Be careful about what you say correlates with each other. But this one, think of the two options. Either the more wealth the world gets, the more meat and poultry they consume. Or it's the other way around. The more meat and poultry we consume, the richer we all get. I think we know which one it is, right? So where this gets interesting, the IMF and World Bank put out a 10-year forecast of GDP. And so looking at that previous chart, I can say, okay, you tell me what GDP is going to be the next 10 years, and I'll tell you almost exactly how much meat and poultry we're going to need. Which is what I did. And the reality is, there's no way we can keep up. There's no physical way we can produce what this model would say. So I have faded that forecast, and you can see it on the chart. 2023 out to 2032, you can see my tilt slants a little bit. One, because we are going through a massive beef herd liquidation over the next 3 to 5 years. But two, just simply because of resources and pressure, we're not going to be able to keep that pace. So what my forecast suggests is 25 trillion more GDP over the next 10 years creates demand for 56 million tons more meat and poultry. Now, the last 10 years, we grew by 43 million tons. What I'm telling you, the next 10 years, the world is going to have to grow meat and poultry faster than we did the last 10 years. And we're going through a herd liquidation in cattle. And we're losing thousands of our best acres every year to urban sprawl. And we have activist pressure, and we have climate policy, and fill in the blank. What I'm telling you here is demand looks really good. In fact, on a global basis, we are going to be looking for every type of productivity we can find to keep pace. This is global meat and poultry supplies with the UN FAO forecasts. Beef, pork, poultry. I don't have sheep and lamb on there, but they would be a small sliver on the top. But think about what that means. There's the trend line for the last, 30 years? 30-year trend line, and look what supplies are forecast to do. We are simply not going to keep pace with the demand that looks like is coming down the road ahead of us. The highest bidders will get the meat. This is good news, right? As producers of meat, this is good news. So let's shift gears for just a minute and talk about how we balance the drive for cost competitiveness with outside pressure. Who is the customer? Is it consumers or is it activists? And I would tell you, and you guys get this, in the marketplace, there's so much noise. There's all these different messages competing to move product. Go into any grocery store, and I know down here you have Kohl's and Woolworths. Go into the meat case and just look at products. There is so much noise. I don't know how consumers that didn't grow up in the meat industry make a decision, because you've got so many different options. I love that. I love that a meat case can clear product based on what consumers want. My belief is you should put every type of product in the meat case and let consumers vote with their dollars. I have no problem with that. My concern is when we try to legislate and we take choices away from consumers. So consumer choice, if you look around the world, the majority of consumers' purchase decisions are based on three things: taste, safety, and affordability. And that's out of some research out of the US and out of Europe. Taste, safety, and affordability. Those are the big voices. However, food can also claim it's sustainable, carbon neutral, locally grown, fill in the blank. Now, a year ago, Simon did he got a Churchill Fellowship out of Australia, and he went and traveled the world and did a big research project on sustainability. And one of the findings he found, he said, I went to, what did he go to, 12 countries? He said, I never found a market anywhere on this planet where consumers would pay $1 more or 1 penny more for carbon neutral beef. He said, one of my goals was to go find a premium market for carbon neutral beef. And he said, I never found one. There is nowhere on earth that people will pay extra for carbon neutral beef. Kind of interesting. But what about the activist pressure? Think about what that means. Activists are trying to limit consumer choice to build their own agenda against meat consumption. They love legislation because legislation takes away consumer choice. The consumer's maybe not educated enough to know that that's unsafe, so therefore we need to legislate and save them from themselves. We see that in America. They love using social guilt. I think social guilt is the most powerful influence in the world today. If you can make people feel guilty about it, we can change. Did you see what happened in the Olympic Village in France? No meat products in the Olympic Village. That was all about social guilt. Countries had to bring their own in. Social guilt is powerful, and it's also tied to perceived health. And thank you, Anneline, for what you just shared with us about nutrition. So what's their strategy? Raise production costs. We want to regulate this meat industry, raise the costs so that no one can afford it. They've been very open about that message. They love to spur social guilt, and they want to limit consumers' options. Is it working? Yes and no. And I'm going to show you an example. I say no because people love meat. I look at the price of meat around the world, absolutely incredible. In America, we've seen those retail prices 20-30% higher than they were pre-COVID. Do not even begin to threaten to take away Americans' meat because they will pay way more than you think for it. Here's an example of where it is working in California. California is the example of all weirdness in America, if you haven't noticed. California passed a law that said if all pork sold in the state of California from pigs must comply with California laws on production, meaning every sow has to have 24 square feet. I don't know where they got to 24, but that was the California magic number. Now, we've had a lot of states impose production practices, but California said, no, this applies to all pork eaten in California. Well, California doesn't really produce pork. Most of their pork comes from the other states. So they imposed a law on the other 49 states that eventually went to the Supreme Court and was upheld by the activist ruling. So in California, they said any pork going in has to come from a farm that meets California standards. It's called Proposition 12. This shows the price change of California pork against the other 49 states' price change since that rule was implemented. Pork loins in California now cost 41% more. On average, fresh pork in California is 20% more expensive today. That's going to cost Californians about $320 million a year, and it also reduces the consumption. And so one of the problems in our pork market right now in the U.S. is the other 49 states have a lot more pork because California is 36 million people. They're eating less pork. They raised the price, got people to eat less. It forces more pork on the other 49 states. It's a huge win for the activists. And I'm sure they're not done there. They're going to go try and find other states to take that show on the road. And so again, these guys legislatively, that's a huge win because they just took the choice away from consumers. So, do we save the planet by stop eating meat? Does that really save the planet? Take a look at this. This is a chart taken right out of the International Panel for Climate Change most recent report, the IPCC. This is figure 7.8 in that recent report. This is global temperature rises since 1990 attributed to CO2 and CH4, which is methane, or as Simon reminds me, methane, right? This is methane. So the blue line is climate change attributed to methane. And the first bar, the first line on that chart is 0.2 degrees Celsius. So the change in global temperature due to methane is somewhere around 0.05 or 5/100ths of 1 degree in 30 years. If we reduce the methane footprint, and methane, all the livestock debate is all centered around methane, then we reduce 0.05 hundredths to 0.25, 0.025, 25 hundredths of a degree is what we're fighting over here. This is crazy, right? Now, one of the things you got to realize, we're getting a lot better data on this climate situation than we had 15 years ago when it was all generated by activists. We are getting much better prepared to discuss how to move forward. The battle is real. This is just out of the past year in Europe. You saw protesters at the Louvre splattered the Mona Lisa with tomato soup. Actually, they splattered the glass that protects the Mona Lisa with tomato soup. What were they protesting? We need more strict climate commitments. People aren't strict enough on our climate commitments. Fast forward about 3 months, you've got farmers in the streets in Brussels protesting, saying your climate policies are making us all go out of business. So that is really a conflict, and it is a battle, and it's really being fought in Europe much more aggressively than anywhere else in the world. And so it's something that we got to pay attention to closely there. Now, again, the opportunities are there, and the marketplace is very efficient at resolving this if we just let it. 2019, Beyond Meat comes out, raises hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. Over 120 alternative plant-based meat companies start up worldwide, over 100 companies. It is the new craze. We're going to fix this. No more livestock. I remember the CEO of Cargill Foods in America came out and said, this plant-based meat will be 10% of the retail case within a decade. And I remember just shaking my head going, I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of Americans, and I'm biased, right? I'm a rural ag boy, but I don't know a lot of people that want to eat this. The stock price of Beyond Meats peaked at $238 a share, and you can see here, you could buy it last week for $6.75 a share. This is one of the big head fakes of our generation. The whole world was behind this. It sounded like, I mean, I speak at a lot of conferences. Every conference had a speaker on this. This is the new thing. And we watched it just utterly and totally collapse. Investor appetite is not proof of concept, right? Just because the investors love it doesn't mean it's going to fly. The consumers have got to love it, and they just did not love that, nor do they, the plant-based stuff. Here's some of the recent headlines. Plant-based meat boomed, here comes the bust. Plant-based meats are not making it. In Denmark, they're going, we need to get government funding to make people eat this stuff. And now that's probably what they're going to try to do in America. Plant-based meat needs a government support to scale up. People won't eat it, we're going to pay them to eat it. We got to put governments... This is not right, right? Let consumers vote with their dollars. Is there really such a thing as low-carbon beef? That's a good debate. Take a look at this. And this isn't about climate change or animal welfare, but this is a major productivity tool, antibiotics. As profits plunge, Tyson pulls back on costly antibiotic-free beef. They came out and said simply, we cannot afford this. Producing beef raised without antibiotics entails extra costs that may not pay off. So they came out and pushed back against consumers, said, we're going to reduce this offering. It simply doesn't make money. For something to work in the market, somebody's got to pay for it. And it's best if it's a consumer and not government. What about this? McDonald's says no more McPlant. They came out with the McPlant burger. They launched it in 600 locations. Sales dropped from 500 burgers a week to 20 burgers a day in 600 locations. That tells you how bad of a product this is, right? They said, we're out. This does not work. They're just pulling it off the menu. I want you to understand this chart here carefully. This is out of the International Panel for Climate Change. The first bar is global livestock emissions. The second bar floating is what's going to be added by 2050 if we do nothing. The third bar is the combined total 2050 livestock emissions, and then all of these are the ways that they get livestock emissions down to where they want them to be, which is the last bar. Take a look at that right there. That is productivity and breeding changes. The biggest thing you can do to reduce the carbon footprint of livestock is productivity and breeding changes. What happens if we quit eating meat? Well, there's the dietary changes. Almost none of it is due to dietary. If you look down the list at these, feed improvements, animal health, biometrics, manure management, there are a lot of things we can do. Not eating meat is really not going to move the needle on this story. The activists have hijacked that agenda. So when it comes to agriculture and climate policies, know the truth. Livestock accounts for 12% of global emissions, maybe. It was estimated at 18% in 2007 when the first report came out. It's 4% of U.S. emissions. Climate policy is all about sticks and carrots. The stick is legislation. Thus saith the government, you have to do X, Y, Z. The carrot is, hey, if you want to do this, you can make some money at it. But you've got to prove that concept. Like I said, there is no premium for carbon neutral beef today. How's it going? Well, we've had farmer protests in Europe for 3 years over that legislation. Sri Lanka was touted as the World Economic Forum's poster child, going, hey, they've implemented our new agriculture plan. They banned fertilizer imports. They're doing all this great stuff. Within 2 years, hungry people took over the government. It's not going well, right? We saw the New Zealand tax. We have some New Zealanders here. That tax was overturned. They planned to impose a tax in 2025 that said if you own a cow, you get a bill from the government. That did not go well and has now been overturned. And so what I'm telling you, some of these fights are being won. Now think about your sustainability message and consumer perceptions. These activist groups are very well funded and they're very well organized, and they're trying to paint you as animal abusers and land degraders. And you're lucky today you're going to get to hear from Claire, and Claire is going to straighten this out in a very clear way of what you can do and what we can do as an industry to help that perception. The sustainability message is about communicating what you do and why you do it. Now, I'll tell you, as an industry, if you can unify around a message, that is very powerful. Much more than everybody fighting their own fight. It requires some effort, but it is not expensive to build a message and to build some practices to communicate what you're doing. So some key thoughts and advice. So what, now what? Climate at all cost? No. That has been the message in Europe. What about the cost of feeding people? That's the one thing that no country can fail at. You must feed people. It is socially and morally irresponsible to legislate yield-reducing practices. Legislation is not the answer. We got 1 billion people food insecure today that are only going to be fed with productivity. I would suggest you adopt a common sense approach to climate policy. Observe the unintended consequences before you jump on board. Watch and see what happens in Europe over the next 5 years. They have cut an enormous amount of their agriculture. Hog production, they're looking at culling, what was the number, 200,000 dairy cattle in Ireland just to meet these policies. Watch and see what happens there first. The key pillar of sustainability will always be profitability. Do what you get paid to do. The message of why you do what you do and your stewardship of land and animals must be defended. Build a united message for your consumers. Strengths of Australian sheep and lamb: productivity, scale, market access, competitive cost. Threat: productivity. Now, I'm kind of kidding with that, but you saw what productivity did here the last year, the market. Don't give up on productivity, you need it. But if you overproduce, the market will let you know. Opportunity: lamb is the new Wagyu. Demand is great. Look at the American prices. Global beef supplies are tightening very quickly. Remember that price is the loudest voice in the marketplace. Price always speaks loudest for consumers. Just some closing thoughts. When the boat hits stormy water, don't jump out of the boat. Stay in the ship and weather the storm. All markets cycle. Record lamb production, taking those prices down, is a very reasonable market response. But the golden rule you got to remember is low prices will fix low prices, and vice versa. Key questions: am I competitive in my industry? Is my industry competitive globally? Are there fundamental changes to that global demand? What direction? What key variables drive my bottom line? Look at your productivity, your key performance indicators. How can I identify and adapt to market threats and opportunities? Let me just close with this thought. This is Sir Charles Darwin. It is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives. But the species that survives is the one that is best able to adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. Think about that, right? That is a fantastic message for business. You don't have to be the biggest, you don't have to be the strongest, but you darn well better be able to adapt and adjust to changing environments. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.